The hardest feelings to admit are often the ones you never expected to have in the first place. If someone had told me 3 months earlier that the quiet routine I had carefully built would disappear because of one unexpected houseguest, I would have laughed and gone back to answering electronic mails or writing another line of code. My life in Seattle had become wonderfully predictable after years of learning how to enjoy my own company. I worked as a software engineer from Monday through Friday, visited the same neighborhood coffee shop every Saturday morning, and spent most evenings reading on the small balcony outside my apartment whenever the weather allowed it. My friends called me dependable. My older brother liked to say I had secretly become an 80-year-old man trapped inside a 31-year-old body. I usually laughed because there was some truth to it. Then my sister-in-law called one rainy Thursday evening and changed everything with a single favor. "Ethan," she said warmly over the phone, "my little brother just accepted a photography project in Seattle. It will only last about 3 months. Would you mind letting him stay in your guest room until he finds his own place?" I hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "You remember Liam, do you not?" Of course I remembered Liam Foster. The last time I had seen him, he had been a cheerful college student carrying a camera everywhere he went during a family barbecue. Even back then he had somehow managed to convince complete strangers to smile for photographs within minutes of meeting them. I had always admired how naturally he connected with people because it was something I had never found easy myself. "It is only temporary," my sister-in-law added gently. "He does not know many people in Seattle yet." I looked around my quiet apartment. The guest room had not been used in nearly a year. "Tell him he is welcome," I answered. 2 days later, I found myself standing outside my apartment building beneath gray skies while light rain drifted across the sidewalk. A rideshare vehicle stopped near the entrance, and the rear door opened. Liam stepped out carrying 2 large suitcases, a hiking backpack, and a camera bag slung comfortably over one shoulder. He looked older than I remembered, more confident too, with warm brown hair slightly tousled by the rain and an easy smile that somehow made the gloomy afternoon seem brighter. The moment he spotted me, his entire face lit up. "Ethan," he called before crossing the sidewalk with surprising speed. I barely had time to greet him before he stopped directly in front of me. "Thank you for letting me stay with you," he said sincerely. As he spoke, he leaned in just a little closer than I expected, close enough for me to notice the faint scent of fresh rain and cedar from his jacket, close enough that I instinctively forgot what I had planned to say. For one completely ridiculous second, my mind became perfectly blank. I cleared my throat and stepped backward almost immediately, pretending to adjust the strap of one of his bags. "It is no problem," I replied, hoping my voice sounded calmer than I felt. Liam smiled without noticing my awkwardness. "I promise I will not be any trouble." "We will see about that," I joked quietly. He laughed, and the sound echoed warmly between the apartment buildings. As we carried his luggage upstairs, Liam looked around with genuine curiosity, asking about every coffee shop, bookstore, and neighborhood park we passed from the windows. His enthusiasm filled the apartment almost the moment we walked inside. He admired the city view from the living room, thanked me 3 separate times for preparing the guest room, and immediately offered to cook dinner one evening as repayment. Watching him unpack his camera equipment onto the neatly made guest bed, I realized my peaceful apartment no longer felt quite as silent as it had only an hour earlier. Strangely, I was not sure whether that unsettled me or made me feel unexpectedly relieved. Standing alone in the kitchen while Liam happily explored his temporary home, I reminded myself of one simple fact. He was only staying for 3 months. It was a favor for family, nothing more. At least that was exactly what I kept telling myself, even though the memory of him standing unexpectedly close beneath the Seattle rain refused to leave. My thoughts. The first morning with Liam in my apartment began much earlier than I expected. I usually woke up to complete silence, but that Saturday I opened my eyes to the unmistakable smell of freshly brewed coffee and something warm baking in the oven. For a brief moment, I forgot someone else was living with me. Then I heard soft music drifting from the kitchen, followed by the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing. I glanced at the clock. 7:15 in the morning. Pulling on a sweatshirt, I walked into the hallway to investigate. Liam stood at the kitchen counter wearing a simple gray sweater with the sleeves pushed up to his elbows and an apron that looked as though it had been borrowed from someone's grandmother. Pancakes sizzled gently on the stove while fresh fruit waited on neatly arranged plates beside 2 steaming coffee mugs. He turned the moment he heard my footsteps and smiled as naturally as if we had lived together for years. "Good morning," he said cheerfully. "I hope you do not mind. I found flour, eggs, and coffee, so I figured breakfast was the least I could make after taking over your guest room." I looked around my kitchen in complete surprise. "You cooked all of this before 8 o'clock?" He laughed. "Photographers get used to chasing sunrise. Sleeping late feels strange now." I sat at the table while he placed a plate in front of me. The pancakes were somehow lighter than any I had ever managed to make myself. "This is really good," I admitted after the first bite. Liam looked genuinely pleased. My mom insisted everyone in the family should know at least one breakfast recipe by heart. We spent the meal talking about ordinary things. Liam described the photography project that had brought him to Seattle, explaining that he wanted to capture everyday acts of kindness happening throughout the city instead of famous landmarks. "Anyone can photograph the Space Needle," he said. "I would rather remember the stranger holding an umbrella over someone else during the rain." I smiled despite myself. "That sounds much harder." "Exactly," he replied. "The best moments usually happen when nobody realizes they are creating them." Later that morning, Liam asked whether I could recommend a good bookstore nearby. I offered to walk with him since I needed groceries anyway. The neighborhood looked especially beautiful after the overnight rain, with sunlight finally breaking through the clouds and reflecting across damp sidewalks. Liam carried his camera almost constantly, stopping every few minutes whenever something caught his attention. A child laughing while chasing pigeons through a small park. An elderly couple sharing a bench outside a bakery. A musician performing for only 3 people who listened as though he were playing to a full concert hall. Each time Liam quietly lifted his camera, he waited patiently until the moment felt genuine before pressing the shutter. Watching him work fascinated me. He never interrupted people or asked them to pose. He simply noticed details everyone else hurried past. As we continued walking, I realized I had barely spoken for nearly 20 minutes. "What?" Liam asked with an amused smile after noticing me looking at him. "Nothing." I hesitated before answering honestly. "You pay attention to things most people miss." He shrugged lightly. "Maybe that is because I spent years feeling invisible myself." His answer surprised me. The outgoing man I had met yesterday suddenly revealed a quieter side hidden beneath his constant optimism. Before I could ask more, he pointed toward a small independent bookstore across the street. "That place looks perfect." Inside the shop, we wandered separate aisles until Liam suddenly appeared beside me holding a photography book, standing close enough for our shoulders to almost touch. He showed me a page filled with candid portraits and smiled. "This is exactly the kind of work I want to create someday." I glanced from the photographs to the excitement in his eyes and found myself smiling back without even realizing it. Somewhere between breakfast, bookstores, and quiet conversations, the careful distance I had promised myself to maintain had already begun to shrink, and although I still reminded myself that Liam was only staying for 3 months, my apartment no longer felt like it belonged to just one person anymore. 3 days later, I came home expecting the apartment to be as quiet as it always had been before Liam arrived. Instead, I found camera lenses spread neatly across the dining table beside a small collection of cleaning tools, soft cloths, and several memory cards. Liam looked up from his work the moment I unlocked the front door. "Perfect timing," he said with an encouraging smile. "Can I ask you a favor?" I placed my laptop bag beside the couch. "That depends on how difficult it is." He picked up his favorite camera with an apologetic expression. "The autofocus keeps behaving strangely. It works for a few minutes, then suddenly refuses to lock onto anything." I already tried updating the settings, but nothing changed. I accepted the camera from his hands and carefully examined it. Years of working as a software engineer had quietly turned me into the person friends called whenever electronics behaved unexpectedly. "Let me take a look," I replied. Liam followed me into the living room, watching with patient curiosity as I removed the lens and inspected the tiny metal contact points. Everything appeared clean, but one connector seemed slightly misaligned. After carefully adjusting it and updating the camera firmware, I restarted the system before handing it back. Liam raised the camera toward the bookshelf. The focus snapped into place immediately. He lowered it again, then aimed toward the balcony. Once again, the image became perfectly sharp. His face brightened with genuine relief. You fixed it. I smiled. It was mostly a tiny hardware issue mixed with outdated software. Liam looked at the camera almost affectionately before laughing. I owe you dinner. You already made breakfast. Then I owe you 2 dinners. That evening we cooked together instead of ordering takeout. Liam handled the vegetables while I prepared the pasta. The kitchen was not especially large, so we often found ourselves reaching for the same cabinet or drawer at nearly the same time. Each accidental pause ended with one of us quietly stepping aside while the other smiled in appreciation. Somehow those small moments felt surprisingly comfortable instead of awkward. During dinner, Liam opened his laptop and began organizing the photographs he had captured around Seattle. Would you like to see what I have been working on? He asked. I moved my chair closer without thinking. The first photograph showed an elderly man carefully tying the shoelace of his young grandson outside a neighborhood library. Another captured 2 strangers laughing together after chasing papers scattered by the wind. There were no famous landmarks, no dramatic scenery, only ordinary people sharing quiet moments of kindness. These are beautiful, I said honestly. Liam looked relieved. Most clients expect spectacular landscapes, but this is different. I continued scrolling through the collection until one photograph made me stop. It showed the morning sunlight pouring through my apartment kitchen while I stood by the coffee maker, completely unaware that anyone was watching. My face was relaxed, and I was smiling faintly at something outside the window. When did you take this? I asked in surprise. Liam suddenly looked embarrassed. Yesterday morning. I was testing the repaired autofocus. I was going to delete it if you did not like it. I studied the photograph again. I do not usually smile like that. You did, Liam answered softly. You just did not know anyone was looking. His words stayed with me long after I closed the laptop. For years I had seen myself as someone ordinary, predictable, and almost invisible. Somehow Liam's camera had captured a version of me I had never noticed before. Later that night, while he returned to editing photographs in the guest room, I remained alone in the living room thinking about that single image. It was only a photograph, yet it quietly revealed something unexpected. Maybe the person I believed I was and the person other people actually saw were not exactly the same, and for reasons I could not yet explain, I found myself wondering which version Liam had noticed first. The weather forecast promised only light rain that Friday afternoon, so neither Liam nor I thought twice about walking to the neighborhood cafe after he finished photographing a local community event. Halfway there, the sky suddenly darkened, and within minutes the familiar Seattle drizzle transformed into a steady downpour. We laughed as we hurried beneath the awning of the nearest coffee shop, both slightly out of breath. I thought photographers were supposed to predict the weather. I joked while brushing raindrops from my jacket. Liam grinned, running one hand through his damp hair. We predict lighting, not miracles. The cafe was warm, filled with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and cinnamon pastries. Every table near the windows was occupied except for one small corner beside the glass, where rain streamed gently down the outside. We settled into the quiet space, each ordering a hot drink while waiting for the storm to pass. Liam rested his camera bag carefully beside his chair before looking out at the gray streets beyond the window. Rain changes everything, he said thoughtfully. Most people think it ruins photographs, but I think it helps people slow down long enough to notice each other. I followed his gaze. Outside, strangers shared umbrellas, a cyclist stopped to help someone pick up scattered grocery bags, and a little girl laughed while splashing through puddles as her father tried unsuccessfully to keep her dry. You were right, I admitted. Those are the moments you always seem to find. Liam smiled quietly. They were always there. I just learned to wait for them. After a comfortable silence, he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Can I ask you something? I nodded. What made you become a software engineer? The question surprised me because very few people had ever asked why instead of simply what I did for a living. I looked down at the steam rising from my mug before answering honestly. When I was younger, I liked solving problems because computers always made sense. If something broke, there was usually a reason. If you worked patiently enough, you could fix it. Liam listened without interrupting. People are different, I continued with a small smile. They are much harder to understand. He tilted his head slightly. Is that why you keep so much of yourself hidden? His words caught me completely off guard. I stared at the rain outside for several seconds before speaking again. After college, I was in a relationship that ended badly. Nothing dramatic happened. We simply wanted different futures. Ever since then, I convinced myself that keeping life simple was safer than risking disappointment again. Liam nodded gently, his expression filled with quiet understanding instead of sympathy. That explains why your apartment felt so carefully organized. I laughed softly. Too organized? Just enough to tell me someone had been protecting his heart for a long time. I looked at him with genuine surprise. You notice everything, do you not? Only the things people accidentally reveal. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows while neither of us spoke for a while. Eventually, Liam took a slow breath before sharing something of his own. I have moved from city to city for photography jobs over the last few years, he admitted. Meeting new people is easy. Leaving them behind never gets easier. There was no sadness in his voice, only honesty. Somehow that made his confession feel even more personal. As the clouds slowly began to clear, sunlight pushed through the rain and reflected across the wet streets outside. Liam lifted his camera and captured the golden light spilling through the cafe window before lowering it again with a quiet smile. Moments like this disappear quickly, he said. I looked at the photograph preview on the screen, then back at him. Maybe that is why they matter so much. When we finally stepped back onto the sidewalk, the rain had stopped completely, but something inside me had changed. We had walked into the cafe as two people escaping a storm. We walked out carrying pieces of each other's stories that neither of us had planned to share. And for the first time since Liam arrived in Seattle, I realized I was no longer counting the weeks until he would eventually leave. The following Sunday arrived with something I had quietly forgotten to expect from weekends. Instead of spending the entire day alone with work or books, I found myself helping Liam load camera equipment into the back of my car before driving across town for my sister-in-law's family gathering. She had insisted everyone meet because Liam had finally settled into Seattle, and apparently declining the invitation had never been a realistic option. As we pulled into the driveway, laughter was already drifting from the backyard, where children chased each other through the grass, while adults carried bowls of homemade food onto long picnic tables. The moment my sister-in-law spotted us, she waved enthusiastically. There you are, she called before pulling Liam into a warm hug. And Ethan actually convinced you to leave your apartment. That might be the biggest surprise today. I rolled my eyes while everyone laughed. I leave the apartment. For groceries, my older brother answered with perfect timing. Liam laughed harder than anyone else. Throughout the afternoon, the gathering felt relaxed and familiar. Liam fit naturally into every conversation, helping my father carry folding chairs, entertaining my nieces with funny animal impressions, and somehow remembering the names of distant relatives I had already forgotten. Watching him move effortlessly from one group to another, I understood why people felt comfortable around him within minutes of meeting him. Later, while everyone gathered around the backyard grill, my sister-in-law looked from Liam to me with an amused smile. You two seem to be getting along surprisingly well. I nearly choked on my iced tea. He has not complained about my cooking yet, Liam answered playfully before I could respond. That is because you cook better than Ethan, my brother added with a grin. That is not a difficult achievement, I admitted, earning another round of laughter. The teasing remained harmless, but as the afternoon continued, more playful comments appeared. One aunt smiled warmly and said we looked like brothers who had finally learned to cooperate. Another relative joked that Liam had somehow managed to convince the quietest person in the family to smile more often. None of the comments carried any hidden meaning, yet I caught myself becoming strangely self-conscious. Every time Liam stood beside me to refill a drink or asked if I wanted another slice of pie, I instinctively took half a step backward without realizing it. At first, Liam did not seem to notice. Then, while everyone else became distracted by a backyard game, he quietly walked over holding 2 glasses of lemonade. Did I do something wrong? He asked gently. I blinked. What? You have been avoiding standing near me all afternoon. His voice remained calm, free from accusation. If I said something that made you uncomfortable, I would rather know. My chest tightened. The truth hovered at the edge of every answer I almost gave, but none of them felt safe enough to speak aloud. You did nothing wrong, I replied quietly. I have just been thinking about work. Liam studied my face for a moment before offering a small, understanding smile. All right. He did not press further. Somehow that kindness made the guilt even heavier. On the drive home, the car felt much quieter than usual. Liam looked out the passenger side window, watching the evening sunlight fade behind the Seattle skyline, while softly reviewing photographs from the family gathering on his camera screen. I kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, replaying our conversation again and again. The closer I felt to him, the more carefully I believed I needed to protect the boundaries surrounding our lives. Yet every attempt to create distance only seemed to hurt someone who had never given me a reason to pull away. When we finally arrived at the apartment, Liam paused before going inside and turned toward me with the same easy smile he had worn since the day he arrived. "Thank you for bringing me today," he said sincerely. "It already feels a little more like home here." I smiled back, but the words settled heavily inside my heart because I had begun to realize something I was desperately trying not to admit. Home no longer felt like a place where I lived alone. It was slowly becoming wherever Liam happened to be, and that truth frightened me far more than I wanted to admit. The family gathering stayed on my mind far longer than I wanted it to. Every playful joke, every casual smile, and every moment when I had instinctively stepped away from Liam replayed in my thoughts throughout the following week. I convinced myself that creating a little distance was the responsible thing to do. It was only temporary, I reasoned. Liam would finish his photography project, find his own apartment, and life would quietly return to the predictable routine I had once considered perfect. That plan sounded logical inside my head. Unfortunately, my heart refused to cooperate. I started leaving for work earlier than usual, often before Liam woke up. In the evenings, I stayed at the office longer than necessary, volunteering for extra software testing that could easily have waited until the next morning. Whenever Liam suggested grabbing dinner together or walking to the bookstore, I politely declined with another excuse about deadlines. None of my reasons were completely false, but none of them were the real reason either. One evening, I returned home just after sunset, expecting the apartment to be empty. Instead, I found Liam sitting quietly on the balcony with his camera resting on the small table beside two untouched mugs of tea. He looked up and smiled when he heard the sliding door open. "I made tea," he said. "I was not sure when you would be home." I hesitated before taking the empty chair across from him. The Seattle skyline glowed softly beneath fading daylight, while a cool breeze carried the scent of rain through the neighborhood. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different now. It was no longer comfortable simply because we enjoyed each other's company. It carried questions waiting to be answered. Finally, Liam looked toward me with gentle seriousness. "Can I ask you something without you pretending everything is fine?" I nodded slowly. "Of course." He rested both hands around his mug. "Did something change after the family barbecue?" My heartbeat immediately quickened. "Why would you ask that?" "Because ever since then you have been disappearing." His voice remained calm, never accusing. "You leave before I wake up. You come home after I fall asleep. When we are in the same room, it feels like you are somewhere else." I looked down at my untouched tea. "I have just been busy." Liam smiled sadly. "Ethan, you are an excellent software engineer." He paused before adding softly, "You are not a very convincing liar." I let out a quiet breath, realizing there was little point pretending any longer. "You did nothing wrong," I admitted. "Then help me understand." I searched for words that had felt impossible to say ever since he moved into my apartment. The closer we became, the more complicated everything started feeling. Liam listened without interrupting. "You are family," I continued carefully. "Not by blood, I know, but close enough that I keep wondering whether I should be creating more distance instead of less." The confession hung quietly between us. Liam looked toward the city lights before speaking again. "I spent days trying to figure out what mistake I had made." He smiled faintly without looking at me. "It never occurred to me that your silence might come from trying to protect both of us." His understanding somehow made everything even harder. "I do not want anyone to misunderstand us," I admitted. "Neither do I," Liam answered gently. "But avoiding someone you care about is not the same thing as protecting them." Those words settled deeply inside me because I knew they were true. We remained on the balcony until the first stars appeared above the city. Before standing to return inside, Liam picked up his camera and quietly showed me the newest photograph on the screen. It was a simple picture of the empty chair beside his own, taken only minutes before I arrived home. "I almost deleted this," he said with a small smile. "Then I realized it tells the truth." I looked at the image for a long moment. The empty chair somehow captured every conversation we had avoided, every excuse I had made, and every feeling I had tried to ignore. As we walked back into the apartment together, I realized distance had never made anything simpler. It had only made the silence louder than either of us deserved. The conversation on the balcony changed something neither of us could pretend had not happened. We never spoke about it again during the next few days, yet the silence between us no longer felt cold. It felt careful, as though both of us understood we were standing at the edge of a decision that neither wanted to rush. Then, one Tuesday evening, I arrived home to find several moving boxes, stacked neatly beside the front door. For a second my heart stopped. Liam emerged from the guest room carrying another box filled with books and camera equipment before noticing the expression on my face. "I should have told you earlier," he said gently. "A small apartment became available 2 neighborhoods away. The lease starts this weekend." I looked at the boxes, suddenly aware of how empty the living room already seemed. "That was faster than I expected," I admitted. Liam smiled softly. "It was always the plan. I promised your sister-in-law I would not stay forever." I nodded because he was right. This arrangement had always been temporary. Nothing about the situation had changed except me. Over the next several evenings we packed together after dinner. Every object carried a memory that somehow belonged to both of us now. The coffee mugs we had used after getting caught in the rain. The photography books we had discovered inside the neighborhood bookstore. The small plant Liam had insisted would make the apartment feel more alive. Even the repaired camera rested carefully inside its padded case, reminding me of the night we first spent hours talking over homemade pasta. None of those things had seemed important while they were happening. Looking back, they suddenly felt like chapters of a story quietly reaching its final pages. On Saturday morning, we loaded the last boxes into my car and drove to Liam's new apartment. It was bright, comfortable, and only 15 minutes away, with large windows overlooking a tree-lined street. "It is perfect," I said honestly while helping him carry the final box inside. Liam looked around with an appreciative smile. "It already feels like home." I smiled back, but the word landed differently than it had before. After everything was unpacked, we stood awkwardly near the doorway, neither of us quite ready to leave. "Thank you," Liam said sincerely. "Not just for letting me stay here. For everything." "You do not have to thank me." "I do." He hesitated before adding, "These last few months reminded me what it feels like to belong somewhere." I looked at him for a long moment, wanting to answer with complete honesty, yet still unable to find the courage. Instead, I simply wished him luck with the rest of his photography project and drove home alone. The apartment greeted me with a silence I used to love. This time it felt unfamiliar. The guest room stood perfectly clean with the bed neatly made, but opening the door no longer brought a sense of order. It only reminded me that someone important was missing. The following week I caught myself reaching for 2 coffee mugs before realizing I only needed one. I walked past the bookstore and instinctively wondered whether Liam would want to stop inside. During lunch breaks, I noticed moments around the city that I knew he would have photographed, and more than once I reached for my phone before remembering there was no ordinary reason to send him a message. One evening, while organizing a shelf in the living room, I discovered a small framed photograph tucked carefully behind a stack of books. It was the candid picture Liam had taken of me standing by the kitchen window, smiling without realizing anyone was watching. On the back of the frame, written neatly in blue ink, was a single sentence. "Sometimes people need someone else to show them who they already are." I stood there holding the photograph for several minutes before quietly laughing at myself. I had spent weeks convincing myself that creating distance would protect us both. Instead, all it had done was teach me one undeniable truth. I did not miss having a guest in my apartment. I missed Liam. And for the first time since all of this began, I stopped trying to pretend those were 2 different things. For the next 2 weeks, I carried the framed photograph everywhere inside my thoughts, even though it never left the bookshelf in my apartment. Every morning before leaving for work, I caught myself glancing at it for a second longer than necessary. Every evening, I wondered whether Liam had discovered another quiet moment somewhere in Seattle worth photographing. We exchanged occasional text messages about practical things. He asked if a package had accidentally been delivered to my apartment. I recommended a bakery near his new neighborhood. The conversations remained friendly, but they carefully avoided everything that actually mattered. Then one Saturday morning, my sister-in-law called. "Liam is opening a small photography exhibition tomorrow afternoon," she said excitedly. "It is mostly for friends and local artists. You are coming, right?" I hesitated for only a moment before answering. Of course. The gallery occupied a renovated brick warehouse near the waterfront, filled with natural light pouring through tall, industrial windows. White walls displayed dozens of Liam's photographs, each capturing simple moments that most people would have walked past without noticing. Visitors moved quietly from one image to another, smiling as they discovered children feeding birds, strangers sharing umbrellas, musicians practicing alone, and neighbors helping each other carry groceries. Every photograph carried the same quiet message. Ordinary kindness deserved to be remembered. I found Liam speaking with several guests near the entrance. The moment he saw me, his smile became warmer than the polite one he had been offering everyone else. "I am really glad you came," he said sincerely. "I would not have missed it," I replied. He thanked another visitor before walking beside me through the exhibition. "Tell me your favorite," he said. We stopped in front of a photograph showing sunlight streaming through the windows of a small cafe while two elderly friends laughed over coffee. "This one," I answered without hesitation. "Why?" I studied the image carefully. "Because nothing dramatic is happening." Liam looked at me curiously. I smiled. "It reminds me that the best memories are usually ordinary while we are living them." He nodded slowly. That was exactly what I hoped someone would notice. As we continued through the gallery, one final photograph waited alone on the last wall. My footsteps slowed the instant I recognized it. It was the picture Liam had taken of me standing in my kitchen beside the morning window, smiling without realizing anyone had been watching. Unlike the small framed copy he had left behind, this version was printed large enough that every detail became visible. Beneath the photograph hung a small handwritten description. "Sometimes people forget to see themselves with the same kindness they offer everyone else." I stared at the words for several long seconds. "You exhibited this?" I asked quietly. Liam looked almost nervous for the first time since I had arrived. "Only because it reminds me of someone who spent years believing he had nothing interesting worth seeing." I turned toward him. "You never asked my permission." He looked genuinely concerned. "If you want me to remove it, I will." I shook my head immediately. "No," taking one slow breath. I finally admitted the truth I had been carrying ever since he moved out. "Actually, there is something I should have said weeks ago." The gallery around us seemed to fade into the background. "When you lived with me, I kept trying to create distance because I thought it was the responsible thing to do." Liam listened without speaking. "Then you left, and I realized the silence was never protecting either of us. It was only hiding how much I already missed you." His expression softened with quiet relief instead of surprise. "Ethan," he said gently, "I was hoping you would eventually tell me that." I looked at him with a nervous smile. "You were?" He nodded. "Because I have been carrying the same conversation inside my head ever since I moved into that apartment. For the first time since everything began, neither of us searched for another excuse, another delay, or another reason to step backward. We simply stood together beneath the afternoon light, finally choosing honesty over fear, and somehow the truth felt gentler than all the silence that had come before it. The drive home from Liam's photography exhibition felt strangely peaceful. For the first time in weeks, I was no longer arguing with myself about feelings I had tried so hard to ignore. The conversation we shared beneath the gallery lights had not solved every question waiting ahead of us, but it had done something far more important. It had replaced uncertainty with honesty. The following weekend, my older brother invited everyone to Sunday dinner at his house, a tradition our family rarely missed. As I parked outside, I noticed Liam arriving only a few minutes later. We exchanged a quiet smile before walking toward the front door together. Nothing about that simple moment felt forced anymore. Inside, the familiar sounds of family filled every room. My nieces chased each other through the hallway while my sister-in-law finished setting dishes on the dining table. The comforting smell of homemade lasagna drifted through the house, instantly reminding me of childhood holidays. During dinner, the conversation moved easily from work to travel plans, neighborhood events, and Liam's photography exhibition. My sister-in-law beamed with pride. "The photographs were beautiful," she said warmly. "I almost cried looking at some of them." Liam laughed softly. "That was not my original goal, but I will gladly accept the compliment." My older brother nodded in agreement. "Your exhibition reminded everyone to slow down. We probably need that more often." Listening to them, I realized how much Liam had already become part of the rhythm of our family long before either of us understood what he meant to me. As dessert was served, my brother suddenly looked toward us with a thoughtful expression. "You know," he said casually, "it is nice seeing you two spending so much time together. Ethan smiles a lot more these days." I nearly dropped my fork. Liam glanced at me before lowering his eyes with a shy smile. My sister-in-law laughed. I noticed that too. He used to answer every question with one sentence. Now he actually tells stories. Everyone chuckled gently. There was no teasing, no hidden judgment, only genuine affection. I exchanged a quiet look with Liam, silently realizing we had been carrying far more fear than anyone else. After dinner, I offered to help wash the dishes while everyone else gathered in the backyard. My sister-in-law joined me a few minutes later, drying plates beside the sink. She worked quietly for a moment before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" I nodded. "Of course." She smiled kindly without looking directly at me. "Are you happy?" The question caught me completely off guard. "Yes," I answered after a long pause. "Happier than I have been in a very long time." She placed another plate into the cabinet before turning toward me. "That is what I hoped you would say." I looked at her, surprised. She laughed softly. "Ethan, I have known my little brother his entire life, and I have known you long enough to recognize when someone makes your eyes brighter." I stared at her in silence. She continued gently. "There is no rule saying too kind. Grown adults cannot choose each other simply because life introduced them through family instead of coincidence." The knot I had carried inside my chest for weeks quietly disappeared. "You already knew," I whispered. "I suspected," she admitted with a smile. "The way both of you looked at each other during the exhibition confirmed everything." Before I could answer, Liam stepped into the kitchen carrying an empty pitcher. He stopped when he noticed us smiling. "Did I interrupt something?" My sister-in-law grinned and handed him the pitcher. "Not at all. I was just reminding Ethan that happiness does not always arrive the way we expect." Liam looked at me with quiet understanding. I smiled back without hesitation, no longer feeling the need to hide behind uncertainty. As we walked outside together beneath the warm evening sky, surrounded by the people who had unknowingly brought our lives together in the first place, I realized the family I had been so afraid of disappointing had never asked me to choose between love and belonging. They had simply hoped that, wherever life eventually led us, we would both find someone who made coming home feel easy. Life settled into a rhythm that felt both wonderfully familiar and completely new. Liam's photography project continued to grow, attracting invitations from local galleries and community organizations that wanted him to document everyday stories across Seattle. Meanwhile, my software team had just begun developing a new platform for nonprofit organizations, a project that challenged me in ways I genuinely enjoyed. Although we no longer lived under the same roof, it somehow felt as though we spent more meaningful time together than ever before. Some evenings we met after work at the neighborhood bookstore where everything still smelled faintly of old paper and fresh coffee. Other weekends we wandered through Pike Place Market, stopping whenever Liam spotted a quiet moment worth remembering. I noticed something unexpected during those walks. People often smiled back when Liam raised his camera because they trusted his kindness before they ever noticed the lens. Watching him work continued teaching me lessons that had nothing to do with photography. One Saturday morning, Liam received exciting news while we were eating breakfast at our favorite cafe. A regional arts foundation had selected his Seattle collection for a larger public exhibition that would travel to several cities across the Pacific Northwest. His eyes widened as he reread the electronic mail for the third time. "I cannot believe this is real," he whispered. I reached across the table and smiled. "Believe it?" He looked at me with quiet excitement. "The exhibition opens in 6 weeks. Then we have 6 weeks to make it unforgettable." From that day forward, helping Liam prepare became part of my own routine. I spent evenings reviewing exhibition layouts, organizing digital files, proofreading artist statements, and writing software that helped visitors browse additional photographs through interactive displays. "You know, this is far beyond what I asked you to do," Liam said one night as we reviewed the final gallery plan inside his apartment. I shrugged with a smile. "Maybe. Why are you helping this much?" I looked at him without hesitation. "Because your dream matters to me." The answer came so naturally that neither of us needed to explain anything further. As opening day approached, the gallery staff gathered for the final installation. Large framed photographs lined freshly painted walls, while carefully positioned lights highlighted each image without overwhelming it. Liam moved from frame to frame, making tiny adjustments, occasionally stepping backward to study the overall balance. I watched him from across the room with quiet admiration. Months earlier, he had arrived in Seattle carrying suitcases, a camera, and uncertain plans. Now he stood confidently inside a gallery filled with work that reflected both extraordinary talent and remarkable compassion. Late that evening, after the last photograph had been hung, the gallery director thanked everyone before leaving us alone to enjoy the finished exhibition. Liam slowly walked through the room one final time before stopping in front of the photograph he had once taken of me beside the kitchen window. "I almost left this one out," he admitted. "I am glad you did not," I replied. He smiled thoughtfully. "It reminds me where everything started." I laughed softly. "Actually, everything started when you stood much too close to me outside my apartment building." Liam covered his face for a moment, laughing with genuine embarrassment. "I was just saying thank you." "I know." I shook my head with amusement. "You had no idea what that single moment did to me." He looked at me with warm curiosity. "You completely lost your composure, did you not?" I smiled because there was finally no reason to deny it. "Absolutely." His quiet laughter echoed through the nearly empty gallery before fading into a comfortable silence. Standing together beneath the soft exhibition lights, surrounded by photographs that celebrated ordinary moments, I realized our own story had followed the same pattern. Nothing about it had begun with dramatic declarations or impossible coincidences. It had grown from breakfasts, bookstores, rainy afternoons, shared conversations, and the courage to tell the truth when silence became heavier than honesty. Looking around the gallery, I understood that the life we were building together resembled Liam's favorite photographs. It was never about perfection. It was always about noticing the quiet moments that deserved to be remembered. The grand opening of Liam's traveling exhibition exceeded every expectation either of us had imagined. Visitors filled the gallery from the moment the doors opened, moving slowly from photograph to photograph, while sharing quiet conversations about the ordinary moments displayed on the walls. Some smiled. Others stood silently for several minutes in front of a single image. Watching complete strangers connect with stories Liam had discovered across Seattle reminded me that kindness could travel farther than any camera ever could. Near the entrance, I quietly observed him greeting guests with the same warmth he had shown from the day he first stepped out of that rideshare in front of my apartment. He thanked every visitor personally, listened carefully to every question, and never once acted as though his growing success had changed him. Late that afternoon, after the gallery had finally grown quieter, my phone vibrated with an unexpected electronic mail from the software company where I worked. The subject line immediately caught my attention. A leadership position had become available at the company's new office in Boston, and I had been formally invited to interview for the role. It was the kind of opportunity many engineers waited years to receive. Better compensation, greater responsibility, and the chance to lead an entirely new development team. Under different circumstances, I would have accepted the interview without hesitation. Instead, I found myself staring at the message while my thoughts drifted toward someone standing only a few feet away. That evening, after the final visitors had left, Liam and I walked through the nearly empty streets toward the waterfront. The cool evening breeze carried the familiar scent of salt water and fresh rain, while ferries crossed Elliott Bay beneath the fading orange sky. I kept thinking about the electronic mail until Liam finally noticed my unusual silence. "You have been solving something inside your head for the last 30 minutes, he said with a gentle smile. "Is everything all right?" I handed him my phone without saying anything. He carefully read the message before looking back at me. "Ethan, this is an incredible opportunity." "It is," I admitted. "You should be proud." I smiled faintly. "That is the problem." Liam frowned slightly. "Why?" I looked across the water before answering honestly. 6 months ago, I would have packed my bags immediately because work was the only thing I thought mattered. He waited patiently. Now the decision feels different. Liam returned the phone to me without speaking. After a quiet pause, he finally said, "If Boston is where your future takes you, then you should go." I turned toward him in surprise. Just like that. He nodded with calm sincerity. I spent years traveling from city to city chasing photographs because I believed dreams deserved to be followed. I would never ask you to abandon yours for me. His words were filled with encouragement. yet I noticed the sadness he tried carefully to hide behind his smile. That made my own heart ache even more. "And what about us?" I asked softly. Liam took a slow breath before answering. "If what we have is real, then it deserves honesty instead of sacrifice made out of guilt." We continued walking in comfortable silence until we reached a quiet overlook where the Seattle skyline reflected across the dark water. I realized then that neither of us was trying to persuade the other toward any particular choice. We were doing something much more meaningful. We were trusting each other enough to let the other person choose freely. Looking at Liam beneath the city lights, I understood that love built on respect never demanded that someone give up who they were. Instead, it created the space where both people could become even more fully themselves. For the first time since receiving the electronic mail, I stopped thinking about which decision would be easier. Instead, I began asking myself a far more important question: which future actually felt like home? The interview invitation remained unanswered for 3 days. I read the electronic mail every morning before work and every evening before going to bed, yet each time I closed my laptop without making a decision. My colleagues congratulated me before I had even accepted the opportunity. My manager told me I had earned it through years of dedication. Everything about the offer made perfect sense on paper. The only problem was that life had quietly become much larger than paper. One rainy evening, I left the office later than usual and found myself driving without thinking until I reached the apartment building where Liam had first stayed with me. I parked across the street and looked up at the familiar balcony where we had shared tea, difficult conversations, and long silences that eventually became honesty. The apartment was still mine, but something about it had changed forever. It was no longer the place where I had hidden from disappointment. It had become the place where I first learned that opening my heart did not always end in heartbreak. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. Everything remained exactly where I had left it. The bookshelf still held the framed photograph Liam had taken of me beside the kitchen window. The guest room remained tidy, though now it simply looked like an ordinary room instead of the place where someone had quietly transformed my everyday life. I walked into the kitchen and smiled to myself, remembering the first breakfast Liam had prepared before sunrise. The smell of fresh coffee almost seemed to linger in the air despite existing only in memory. Standing there, I finally understood why making this decision had felt so impossible. I was not choosing between Boston and Seattle. I was choosing between the life I had planned years ago and the life I had unexpectedly built one ordinary day at a time. The following afternoon, I met Liam at the neighborhood bookstore where we had spent so many quiet weekends together. Rain tapped gently against the front windows while customers wandered slowly through the shelves. Liam noticed my thoughtful expression almost immediately. "You made your decision," he said softly. I nodded. "I did." He smiled with quiet encouragement. "Then tell me." I took one slow breath before answering. "I declined the interview." Liam looked genuinely surprised. "Ethan, you did not have to do that because of me." I shook my head immediately. "I did not." I smiled warmly. "Months ago I would have accepted because I believed success meant always chasing the next promotion." I glanced around the bookstore before continuing. "Then you arrived with your camera, your terrible jokes, your early morning pancakes, and your habit of noticing things everyone else ignored." Liam laughed quietly. I'm not sure whether that was a compliment. It absolutely was. I looked directly into his eyes. "You reminded me that I already had a life worth staying for." He remained silent, waiting for me to finish. "Home used to be the apartment where nobody interrupted my routine," I admitted. "Now home is the city where I discovered who I actually wanted to become, surrounded by people who helped me grow into that person." I smiled gently. "You are part of that home." Liam's eyes softened with unmistakable emotion. "Are you certain?" he asked quietly. "Completely." He reached into his backpack and carefully removed a small wrapped package. "I was planning to wait until your birthday, but I think today is the right day instead." Inside the package was a beautifully framed print of the first photograph he had ever taken of me standing beside the kitchen window, smiling without realizing anyone was watching. Beneath the image, he had added a new handwritten sentence. "Home is where someone helps you recognize yourself." I looked at the photograph for a long moment before quietly laughing at how perfectly he always seemed to capture the truth. As we left the bookstore together beneath another gentle Seattle rain, I realized I no longer measured my future by titles, salaries, or opportunities waiting somewhere else. I measured it by the quiet certainty that I was walking beside the person who had unknowingly turned an ordinary apartment, an ordinary city, and an ordinary life into the place where I truly belonged. Several months passed so quietly that neither of us noticed exactly when our ordinary routines became shared traditions. Saturday mornings still belonged to the neighborhood bookstore, Sunday afternoons often ended with family dinners, and almost every evening concluded with a walk somewhere beneath the familiar Seattle sky. Liam's traveling exhibition continued earning recognition throughout the Pacific Northwest, while my nonprofit software project officially launched and began helping community organizations reach thousands of new volunteers. We celebrated each achievement the same way we always had, with coffee, long conversations, and genuine gratitude instead of grand gestures. One crisp autumn morning, sunlight filled my apartment through the same kitchen window where Liam had unknowingly taken the photograph that had changed everything. I stood beside the coffee maker preparing breakfast while Liam leaned against the counter sorting through several printed photographs. From a recent assignment. He suddenly laughed. "What?" I asked, setting 2 mugs on the table. He held up one photograph, showing me concentrating so seriously on flipping pancakes that I had completely failed to notice him taking the picture. "You still have the exact same expression every time you cook," he said. I looked at the photograph before laughing too. "Probably because I am trying very hard not to burn breakfast." "You have improved," he replied with playful confidence. "Slightly." We carried our breakfast onto the balcony where cool autumn air drifted gently through the neighborhood. The trees below had begun turning shades of gold and crimson, and families walked along the sidewalks wrapped in light jackets, while children kicked colorful leaves into the air. Liam rested his camera beside his chair, but made no effort to pick it up. "You are not taking photographs today?" I asked. He smiled peacefully. "Not every beautiful moment needs a camera." We ate quietly for a while before he looked toward the framed photograph hanging inside the living room. It remained in the same place where I had displayed it after he gave it back to me. A simple reminder of the day someone saw happiness in me before I could recognize it myself. "Do you ever think about how close we came to missing all of this?" Liam asked softly. I nodded. "More often than you probably realize." I smiled thoughtfully. "If my sister-in-law had never called, if you had found another apartment immediately, if that rainy afternoon had never happened, or if either of us had stayed silent a little longer, our lives would probably look completely different." Liam looked toward the city skyline glowing beneath the morning light. "I think the little moments mattered more than the big ones." "They always did," I answered. "We just needed time to understand that." Later that afternoon, our family gathered once again for another relaxed Sunday meal. My nieces immediately pulled Liam outside to show him drawings they had made after visiting one of his exhibitions, while my brother quietly handed me a drink with an amused smile. "You know," he said, watching Liam laugh with the children, "I have never seen you this comfortable with yourself." I followed his gaze and smiled without hesitation. "Neither have I." As the afternoon slowly faded into evening, everyone gathered for one final group photograph before saying goodbye. Liam placed the camera on a tripod, adjusted the timer, and hurried back to stand beside me just before the shutter clicked. There was no hesitation this time, no unnecessary distance, and no fear of simply being seen together. Weeks later, when the printed photograph arrived, it found its place beside the first picture Liam had ever taken of me in the kitchen. One image showed a man who had not yet realized he was smiling. The other captured 2 people looking toward the future with complete certainty. Sometimes life changes through extraordinary events, but sometimes it begins with nothing more dramatic than an unexpected guest room, a shared breakfast, a rainy afternoon, and the courage to tell the truth before the moment quietly slips away. Looking at those 2 photographs side by side, I finally understood why Liam had always believed ordinary moments deserved to be remembered. They were never ordinary at all. They were where our entire story had quietly learned to begin, and they would always be the place where our happiest chapters continued.